He just didn't know enough to be prime minister. Well, he's lying, and I'm not. So that's a big part of the issue. I don't believe that he ever says a word that's true.
These terrifying assertions by Jordan Peterson is sure to raise eyebrows and spark debate, particularly given Trudeau's status as a prominent world leader. But the rabbit hole doesn't stop here. Check it out.
Talk to him? Well, if you were to sit down and talk with him and he wanted to talk, would you, and what kind of things would you talk about, perhaps on your podcast?
I don't think I've ever said no to talking to anyone. So, which is,
Would you, would that be a first, or would you make that conversation? Do you believe in the power of
No, I'd
conversation
ask
in
him.
those kinds of contexts?
No, if he was willing to talk to me, I'd talk, because I'd like to ask him. I have lots of things I'd like to ask him about. I mean, I've had political types in Canada on my podcast and tried to ask them questions.
Jordan Peterson clearly doesn't believe the Prime Minister has any good in him, which is even more visible in the following segment.
Why?
So,
what's the motivation?
The same motivation that's generally typical of people who are narcissistic, which is to be accredited with moral virtue in the absence of the work necessary to actually attain it.
All right.
He's playing a role. The swastika thing, it's like, really
just untrue.
About Canadians? Really, we're going to be worried about Nazis in Canada? Because I had protests, for example, where people accused me of attracting Nazis. First of all, that just isn't a thing in Canada. There isn't a Nazi tradition. And I don't know anyone in Canada who's ever met anyone who's met someone who was Canadian and who was a Nazi. And so that's just a non-starter. And so when that sort of thing gets dragged into the conversation, right off the bat, the Canadians shouldn't be subjected to the inherent violence of a swastika.
Terrifying statements like this make you wonder if Justin Trudeau actually wants what's good for the Canadian people. But the more you try and answer these questions, the more sinister it becomes.
Can you steel man the case that the Prime Minister of this country, Trudeau, wants the best for this country and actually might do good things for this country as an intellectual challenge?
Sure. He seems to get along well with his wife. He has some kids. There's no sexual scandals. And he's in a position where that could easily be the case. He seems to have done some good things on the oceanic management front. He's put a fair bit of Canada's oceans into marine protected areas, and that might be his most fundamental legacy, if it's real. I've been trying to get information about the actual reality of the protection, and I haven't been able to do that. But that's a good thing.
So sorry, the family thing is, there's some
It
aspect
speaks to his
of
character.
his character. There is some aspect to him that makes him a good man.
Well,
in that sense.
I mean, there's the evidence there, I mean, he's not a Jeffrey Epstein profligate on the sexual front, so that's something. And his wife, they seem to have a real marriage, and he has kids, so, good for him.
That's a good start, by the way, for a leader.
Yeah, right.
To be a
right.
good man.
Well, then I also thought, after the Liberals had brought in a Harvard intellectual who was a Canadian to be their last leader, he didn't work out. And then they're flailing about for a leader. And the Liberals in Canada are pretty good at maintaining power and leadership and have been the dominant governing party in Canada for a long time. And so they went to Justin and said, well, it's you or a conservative. And you can imagine that's not a positive specter for someone who's on the left, or even a liberal, especially, and Trudeau's quite a bit on the left. And they said, we need you to run. And then I thought, the answer to that should have been no.
Question one. The February protest by Canadian truckers. They're protesting COVID restrictions. Some of them block border crossings. Some of them snarl the capital city of Ottawa. A quotation, then a video clip. Here's the quotation. You, in a message you taped for the protesters, I'd like to commend all of you for your diligence and work on accomplishing what you have under trying conditions, and also for keeping your heads in a way that's been a model for the entire world. Close quote. Now the clip.
It has to stop. The people of Ottawa don't deserve to be harassed in their own neighborhoods. They don't deserve to be confronted with the inherent violence of a swastika flying on a street corner, or a Confederate flag, or the insults and jeers just because they're wearing a mask. That's not who Canadians are.
All right, so here's
Wow.
the
I can hardly even look at him.
here's the first question. How can discourse in a great democracy have become so polarized that Jordan Peterson and the Prime Minister look at exactly the same set of events and come to opposite conclusions about them?
Well, he's lying, and I'm not. So that's a big part of the issue. I don't believe that he ever says a word that's true. From what I've been able to observe, it's all stage acting. He's crafted a persona. He has a particular instrumental goal in mind, and everything is subordinated to serve that.
Why?
So,
What's the motivation?
the same motivation that's generally typical of people who are narcissistic, which is to be accredited with moral virtue in the absence of the work necessary to actually attain it.
All right.
He's playing a role. You know, the swastika thing, it's like really
just untrue.
about Canadians. Really, we're going to be worried about Nazis in Canada? Because I had protests, for example, where people accused me of attracting Nazis. First of all, that just isn't a thing in Canada. There isn't a Nazi tradition. And I don't know anyone in Canada who's ever met anyone who's met someone who was Canadian and who is a Nazi. And so that's just a non-starter. And so when that sort of thing gets dragged into the conversation, right off the bat, you know, the Canadians shouldn't be subjected to the inherent violence of a swastika. First of all, it's not even obvious what that swastika was doing there. There's reasonable evidence to suggest that the person who was waving it was either a plant or someone who was making the comment that that was what was characteristic of the government, not of what they believed. Now, no one knows, because the story around that event is messy, and it's not like there were credible journalists who were going in there to investigate thoroughly. But to use that and the Confederate flag issue is exactly the same thing. You know, the story in Canada, our Prime Minister implemented the Emergencies Act, and so the question was why? And so I went on Twitter when this was trending and read at least 5,000 Twitter comments to try to get a sense. These were people who were supporting Trudeau in his application of the Emergencies Act. And I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do they believe is happening? And the story seemed to be, and this is as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, the story was something like, "Make America Great Again." Conservative Republicans on the, pretty far right were attempting to destabilize Canadian democracy. And so my question was, well, what makes you think they care, first of all, about Canada and its democracy? And second, why in the world would they possibly do that? You need a motive for a crime like that. And that was at the same time the CBC was insisting, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is subsidized by the Liberals to the tune of $1.2 billion a year, was insisting that most of the money that the truckers raised was foreign financed. If it wasn't the bloody Russians, then it was the American conservatives. And so that all turned out to be a complete lie. And so, fine, it's Republican right-wingers trying to destabilize Canadian democracy. Why? No one has an answer for that, because what's in it for them? And then, okay, 3 days later, the Emergency Act was lifted. And I thought, okay, now what are they going to make of that? What could possibly be the rationale for that? And the rationale was, well, that just shows you how effective he was. We had this coup ready to go that was financed by Americans, apparently, and our Prime Minister acted so forthrightly that we only needed to be under the strictures of the Emergency Act for 3 days. It's like, okay, I don't even know what sort of world I exist in where those things are happening. So, and then Canadians, why do Canadians buy this to the degree they do? And I think they're faced with a hard choice, because in my country, for 150 years, you could trust the basic institutions. You could trust the government. Didn't matter what political party was running it. You could trust the political parties, right from the socialists over to the conservatives. The socialists were mostly union types, and they were trying to give the working class a voice, and honestly so. You could trust the media. Even the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was a reliable source of news. None of that's true now, and so Canadians are asked to make a hard choice, or were in the truckers' convoy situation, and the choice was, well, either all your institutions are almost irretrievably corrupt, or the truckers were financed by like right-wing Republican Americans. Well, both of those are preposterous. You might as well take the one that's least disruptive to your entire sense of security. And so I think that's what Canadians did mostly. Trudeau, Justin, has no training for this, no experience. He's a part-time drama teacher fundamentally. He hadn't run a business. He just didn't know enough to be prime minister. But then I'm trying to put myself in his position. So it's like, okay, I don't know enough, but I'm young, and we don't want the Conservatives. And they had a run, a 10-year run, so maybe it was time for a new government. Maybe I could grow into this man. Maybe I could surround myself with good people, and I could learn humbly, and I could become the person I'm now pretending to be, which we all have to do as we move forward, right? And so then I thought, okay, I think you made a mistake there because you ran only on your father's name. You didn't have the background, but let's give the devil his due and say that's no problem. Okay, so now what do? Well, you get elected, and your first act is to make the cabinet 50% women, despite the fact that only 25% of the elected members are female. It's like, okay, you just halved your talent pool. That was a really bad move for your first move.
Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
Do you think, where does that move come from? Deep somewhere in the heart? Or
No.
is it trying to listen to the social forces of the moment and try to ride those ways towards maybe greater and greater popularity?
After thinking it through. It's like, no, you just halved your talent pool for cabinet positions. That's what you did. There's enough cabinet positions. You could argue that each of them met threshold. It's like, there's a big difference between threshold and excellent.
So you don't think that came from a place of compassion?
I don't care if it did. I don't regard compassion as a virtue. Compassion is a reflex, not a virtue.
You don't think...
Judicious compassion is a virtue.
You talk to him? Well, if you were to sit down and talk with him and he wanted to talk, would you, and what kind of things would you talk about, perhaps on your podcast?
I don't think I've ever said no to talking to anyone. So, which is,
Would you, would that be a first, or would you make that conversation? Do you believe in the power of
No, I'd
conversation
ask
in
him.
those kinds of contexts?
No, if he was willing to talk to me, I'd talk, because I'd like to ask him. I have lots of things I'd like to ask him about. I mean, I've had political types in Canada on my podcast and tried to ask them questions. So I'd like to know.
Is there
and
something...
maybe I've got a big part of him wrong.
Yes.
And I probably do. But my observation has been that every chance he had to retreat from his pharaonic position, let's say, he doubled down. And our parliament is not running for the next year. It's still Zoom in. It's still COVID lockdown parliament for the next year. It's already been fatally compromised, perhaps, by the lockdowns for the last couple of years. And this is parliament we're talking about.
Yeah. There's a kind of paralysis, fear-driven paralysis that also, in part, some of the most brilliant people I know are lost in this paralysis. I don't think people assign a word to it, but it's almost like a fear of this unknown thing that lurks in the shadows. And that, unfortunately, that fear is leveraged by people that, who aren't in academic circles, who aren't faculty or students and so on, are more in administration, and they start to use that fear, which makes me quite uncomfortable. It does lend people in the positions of power who are not good at handling that power to become slowly, day by day, a little bit more corrupt.
I was really trying to figure out, the last 2 weeks, thinking this through. It's like, how do you know let's say someone asked me a question in the YouTube comment, said, well, why can I trust your advice on the environmental front? And I thought, that's a really good question. Okay, let's see if we can figure out the principles by which the advice would be trustworthy. Okay, how do you know it's not trustworthy? Well, one potential response to that would be the claims are not in accordance with the facts. But, facts are tricky things, and it depends on where you look for them. So that's a tough one to get right because, for example, Lomberg's fundamental critics argue about his facts, not just his interpretation of them. So that can't be an unerring guide. And so I thought, well, the facts exactly doesn't work because when it's about everything, there's too many facts. So then how do you determine if someone's a trustworthy guide in the face of the apocalyptic unknown? Because that's really the question. And the answer is, they're not terrified tyrants. I think that's the answer. Now, maybe that's wrong. If someone has a better answer,
How do you know if they're a terrified tyrant?
Because they're willing to use compulsion on other people when they could use goodwill. Like the farmers in Canada objected. They said, look, we have every economic reason to use as little fertilizer as we can because it's expensive. We have satellite maps of where we put the fertilizer. We have cut our fertilizer use so substantially in the last 40 years, you can't believe it, and we grow way more food. We're already breaking ourselves in half. And if you know farmers, especially the ones who still survive, you think those people don't know what they're doing. It's like, they're pretty damn sophisticated, man. Like, way more sophisticated than our prime minister. And now you tell them, no, it's a 30% reduction, and we don't care how much food you're growing. So it's not a reduction that's dependent on amount of food produced per unit of fertilizer used, which would be, at least, you could imagine it. So, okay, so you're producing this much food, and you use this much fertilizer, so you're hyper efficient. Maybe we take the 10% of farmers who are the least efficient in that metric, and we say to them, you have to get as efficient as the average farmer. And then they say, well, look, our situation's different. We're in a more northern climate. The soil's weaker. You obviously have to bargain with that, but at least you reward them for their productivity. Well, it's like, well, Holland isn't going to have beef. Well, where are they going to get it? Well, you don't need it. It's like, oh, I see. You get to tell me what I can eat now, do you? Really? Okay. And Holland is going to import food from where that's more efficient on the fertilizer front? There's no one more efficient than Holland. And same with Canada. And isn't this going to make food prices more expensive? And doesn't that mean that hungry people die? Because that is what it means. So
ultimately, poor people pay the price of these kinds of policies.
Not ultimately. Today. That's a crucial distinction because they say, well, ultimately the poor will benefit. Yeah, except the dead ones.
Yes, today.
Today, right.
Just as globally we've agreed to a minimum corporate tax, we must work together to ensure it is no longer free to pollute anywhere in the world. That means establishing a shared minimum standard for pricing pollution. Of course, what's even better than pricing emissions is ensuring that they don't happen in the first place. Which brings me to my next major commitment. We'll cap oil and gas sector emissions today and ensure they decrease tomorrow at a pace and scale needed to reach net zero by 2050. That's no small task for a major oil and gas producing country. It's a big step that's absolutely necessary.
The actor. I see an actor, a simulacrum of the real thing, an appearance on the world's stage. Tell me, Mr. Trudeau, are the unsophisticated rednecks of Alberta not setting to rise in anger against the damned pea soupers of Quebec? What exactly are you doing in Glasgow? saving the world? Are not our flags at half-mast? You have a country to run. Get home. Make peace. Do your job. God help me if my vision in this regard is clouded by my own presumption. But I see an actor, not a real boy.